So are you ready to go back in time? Not to a glamorous castle, not to live like a king, but to dive into an era where dinner felt like a punishment, where bread served as a weapon, and the smell. Well, you can imagine the smell. We are descending straight into the Middle Ages, where everything was strange, uncomfortable, and apparently decided by someone with a deep grudge against humanity. But relax, you won't have to taste any of it. Just listen. And hopefully fall asleep before we get to the part about the rotten cheese. So turn off that light, sink into your pillow, and prepare for one of the slowest, most tedious, and curiously relaxing journeys in human history. Oh, and before sleep takes you, if this particular brand of historical torture helps you drift off, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, leave that like, and comment below what time it is where you are. Who knows, maybe someone is listening to this from the distant future or from the bathroom. Now, let's talk about food, or rather what they called food in the Middle Ages. Imagine waking up hungry. Not that light hunger from skipping breakfast, but a medieval hunger, a hunger that arrives accompanied by lice, a sore back, and a questionable smell coming from the pile of straw where you slept. Your stomach rumbles. You dream of fresh bread, maybe a hot coffee. Forget it. You're having potage. Again, potage. The perfect combination of sustenance and whatever was left in the pot from last week. It was a kind of savory gruel, made with grains, water, slightly withered roots, and anything that wasn't completely rotten yet. There was no recipe. There was only survival. Every spoonful was a surprise. Sometimes you'd get a piece of turnip, sometimes a rat hair, and no one batted an eye. And before you think, well, at least it's hot, let me remind you, the pot simmered over a weak fire, fed with twigs stolen from the feudal lord's forest, which technically could get you the death penalty. And since nobody washed the pot between uses, the bottom was basically gastronomic archaeology, a crust of memories from meals past, and fungi. The bread? Yes, there was bread, but don't get excited. It was as hard as a tax collector's heart and as thick as the dust in your room, made with barley flour, rye, or whatever else they could grind, including tree bark, and in times of crisis, sifted earth. Seriously, they mixed dirt into the bread because chewing on mud was better than dying. Inspiring. Now what about a drink? Water. Only if you wanted to play intestinal roulette. Drinking water was a slow act of suicide. Rivers and wells were full of human waste, dead animals, and a generous dose of nobody cares. So the solution was simple: beer. At 6 in the morning, a weak beer called small beer with very little alcohol. Just enough to kill the germs and keep you functional, or something close to it. Even the children drank it. Yes, 5-year-olds starting their day with a mug of beer. That explains a lot about medieval decision-making. Fruits? Only if it was harvest season. Otherwise, you depended on whatever fermented in the barrel. And even then, fresh fruits were treated with the same frequency we treat a trip to the moon today. Inaccessible. And the cheese? Ah, the cheese. A suspicious block of yellowish fat that sat outside the refrigerator for weeks because, obviously, refrigerators didn't exist. The milk was curdled naturally, red, soured by time, and turned into a solid mass full of surprises. A true gift from the cattle to your intestines. But wait, it gets worse. During the harshest winters, when the stores ran out, many people resorted to what they called famine bread, which included sawdust, bitter roots, bean husks, and whatever else could fit in the dough. Eating was a fight, and losing that fight meant becoming a statistic. Now you understand why nobody smiled in medieval paintings. Spoiler, there's still lunch, and it doesn't get better. Perfect. Let's continue, diving even deeper into what was unfortunately considered food during the Middle Ages. You survived breakfast, which is already an accomplishment. Your body is still trying to understand what that lukewarm broth that tasted like yesterday was. But time doesn't wait for slow digestion. The sun rises in the sky. Not that you can see it. It's been cloudy for 3 months, and here it comes, lunch. But don't get excited. Nobody's preparing a dish from medieval MasterChef. In fact, nobody is preparing anything. Lunch is, at best, a glorious repeat of breakfast. Yes, potage again. Only now it's waterier and sadder. You sit or squat, since chairs are for nobles, near the fire that has almost gone out, and you hold your wooden bowl with the grim determination of someone facing their own destiny. Inside, the same thin broth with fragments of carrot, maybe a grain of barley, and a remote hope for protein. Ah, protein, a distant dream. Meat was a privilege, and even when it did appear, it came with so many reservations it felt more like a memory than a meal. If you hunted a pig or a rabbit on the Lord's land, congratulations, you were now in prison. Hunting without permission was a crime, and the punishment could range from a fine to a public beating or losing an ear. Yes, literally. An ear as a souvenir to remind you that you tried to eat. So, if meat was scarce, what did they eat? Well, there was the usual bread and seasonal vegetables. What season? The one where God decided to send something that didn't die before it sprouted. The star of lunch, when it wasn't potage, was broth of everything. An improvised soup with leaves, roots, leftovers from the previous dinner, which were already leftovers from the one before that. And if luck smiled on you, a bone. Not with meat, just the bone to add flavor, or at least to pretend to. And spices? Ha! That's a good joke. Spices cost more than your house. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, all coming from the east. Transported by caravans and taxed by greedy lords and kings. A handful of pepper could be worth a sheep, a single nutmeg, 2. So what did they use to flavor the food? Onion and salt, if you had a secret stash, or just your own sweat, which also worked as a natural salt. Now, if you were lucky and lived near the coast, fish was an option. But before you picture sushi or grilled salmon, understand this: medieval fish was dry, salted to its very soul, and left in the sun until it became something between meat and wood. Biting it was an exercise in faith and jaw strength. The most common was dried herring. Herring, the most wronged fish in European culinary history. It was stacked, salted, smashed into barrels, and forgotten for weeks until it became food, or something like it. It was tough, salty, full of bones, and smelled of abandonment. But it was, technically, nourishment. And yes, sometimes it came with hard bread. Always there, always present, more reliable than any king. But you know what really marked the medieval lunch? The monotony. Eating was an agonizing repetition. There was no menu of the day. There was what's left over. Culinary imagination was a luxury. The reality was one pot, one weak fire, and a populace with no teeth. And don't even bother complaining about the food being cold, because to heat it, you'd need wood. And guess what? Wood was a noble resource. Only the bare minimum was used, lukewarm food at best. The only time food was truly hot was if you were a noble or if you were on fire. Then, yes, it was hot. And after lunch, work. Because, of course, if you're malnourished, the ideal thing to do is spend the entire afternoon carrying stones, ploughing the land, or trying not to die. Spoiler, there's still dinner. And yes, it was still potage. The sun begins to set. The cold seeps through the cracks in the wall. And your stomach, which was never truly satisfied, tries to remember if it ate today. The answer is, technically, yes. But your body disagrees. So you drag yourself back to the same corner where you always eat, with the same group of hungry people, and the same smell of sweat, smoke, and frustration. Expectations are low, and even so, you are disappointed. Because dinner in the Middle Ages was a bored rerun of lunch, with fewer ingredients and more water. The potage, of course, is there. It never fails. Thinner, more bone, more symbolic than nourishing. A gastronomic gesture, almost a ritual. Eating out of obligation, not for pleasure or nutrition. Sometimes, for variety, someone would throw in an egg. Yes, an egg, but only if the hen had done them the favor of laying one that day, which didn't always happen, because even the hens were discouraged by the situation. On really good days, which happened about as often as eclipses, a tiny piece of cured pork might appear. You know bacon? Forget it. This was closer to salted rubber than anything crispy, but it was meat. And like everything in the Middle Ages, you ate it fast and quiet before someone stronger snatched it from your bowl. Oh, and speaking of bowls, everyone ate with their own wooden spoon, but the plates were often communal. One large vessel in the middle, and everyone attacking it at the same time. No one used a fork. That only arrived much later. The fork was considered heresy for a long time. Eating with a mini trident must be the work of the devil. Literally, that was the logic. Dinner was collective, but it wasn't exactly a social event. It was more of a survival meeting. The general atmosphere was one of exhaustion, the grinding of teeth, the few that remained, and silence. The kind of silence that only someone who has worked 14 hours in the mud can produce. A silence that screams, "I would accept death, but I'm too tired." Dessert? How funny of you. Dessert was an exotic concept. If someone said dessert out loud, they'd probably be beaten for snobbery. But in rare moments, a sweet made of fermented fruit might appear, or a piece of tart made with whatever they could find. Crushed apples, a little honey, and a crust hardened with more flour than sense. Honey, by the way, was the standard sweetener. Sugar was for kings and toothless nobles, literally. Sugar only appeared at religious festivals, weddings, and funerals. Yes, a medieval wake was one of the few chances the common people had to eat something minimally sweet. Nothing like death to give flavor to life. And before you ask about dinner with wine, like in the movies, no. Wine was rare, expensive, and reserved for religious ceremonies or bored nobles. The commoners were stuck with the same weak beer, the same one you had at breakfast and lunch. Because in the Middle Ages, you drank beer all day long, and even then, it wasn't enough to forget the taste of the food. So you finish dinner, or rather, you stop eating because there's nothing left. The hunger remains, but the body accepts it, or pretends to. And now it's time to sleep, right? Wrong. You still have to take care of the animals and prevent anyone from stealing what's left of the food. Yes, because at night, the threat was real. Rats, desperate neighbors, and sometimes your own dog, all trying to get your last onion, and you defending it as if it were a crown jewel. In the Middle Ages, eating was an act of resistance, of survival, of stubbornness. You didn't eat to live, you lived to try to eat. And even so, mortality from malnutrition was common, especially among children, the elderly, and anyone who dared to get sick in the winter. But now, with your stomach partially full and your soul completely empty, it's time to lie down on the straw, in the same place where you live, eat, work, and, well, everything. Spoiler, there's potage tomorrow. There comes a moment in your medieval routine when you stop, look into your bowl of food, if we can even call it that, and ask yourself what exactly is in here. The honest answer? Don't ask. Seriously. It hurts less if you just accept it. Because the Middle Ages had a peculiar talent for turning anything into food, including things that by modern logic should be discarded, buried, or studied by toxicologists. Let's start with the bread, which has been so constant it's practically a character in this story. In times of scarcity, the bread was stretched with whatever was available. Ground tree bark, bone dust, sifted earth, sawdust. Yes, they ate bread with sawdust, and you're over there refusing gluten. Now imagine this scenario. The year was bad, the harvest was terrible, and famine is knocking at the door. What do? You go to the pantry, which in practice is a dark hole that smells like rats, and you find a sack of moldy grain, and you think, well, it's this or nothing, so you choose the mold. Except, sometimes that mold was ergot, a fungus on the rye that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and If you're lucky, a quick death. Yes, basically bread contaminated with medieval LSD, only without the good music or spiritual journey, just vomiting and despair. And the meat? Well, the meat was a mystery. If you had access to it, it was probably because an animal died of natural causes, disease, and nobody wanted to waste it. So it was salted until it turned to stone, hung out in the open air, and scraped off bit by bit with a dull knife. Sanitary standards were a rumor, and even so, meat was so rare that sometimes people invented substitutes, like taking organs, fat, coagulated blood, and making a kind of primitive sausage. That's when they weren't using parts of the animal that the animal itself would be ashamed to offer. Oh, and when there was skin left over, it was boiled, turning into nutritious broth. The natural gelatin from the cartilage was seen as a dietary supplement, but let's be honest, it was basically collagen soup that tasted like feet. And the fish? If you think fish is a healthy option, let me introduce you to salted herring. A fish so salty it seemed to have been seasoned with pure spite. It sat in barrels for weeks, fermenting in its own juices. Sometimes worms appeared. Guess what? They'd pick the worms out and eat the fish anyway, because protein is protein. Besides, worms were a frequent problem, in the fish, in the meat, in the grain, and sometimes in the people. But that's another block. For now, let's focus on the fact that living food wasn't a gourmet luxury. It was just a lack of hygiene. Dairy, another festival of uncertainty. Milk soured in hours, cheese fermented on its own in damp corners, and yogurt, well, it didn't exist. What existed was curdled milk, which was sometimes drunk, sometimes used as a poultice, and sometimes used as an excuse not to eat anything that day. And the vegetables were a roulette of bitterness and flatulence. Turnips, cabbages, onions, all boiled until they became a grey puree. Sometimes the vegetable was so old it had developed a second personality, but it was boiled anyway. If it tasted strange, people just said it was healthier. But maybe the worst ingredient of all was the unknown, that piece floating in the broth, with an undefined color, a dubious shape, and an absent smell, which was worrying, because even a stench was a sign that there was still life. When it smelled like nothing, it was because it had already transcended. And even so, everyone ate it, because it was that or the void. In the Middle Ages, you didn't eat because you liked it. You ate because you had no choice. And the more mysterious the dish, the greater the chance it would show up again tomorrow. Yes, it was always a risk. And no, it didn't get better with time. After a week of eating watery potage, tooth-breaking bread, and salted fish with optional worms, you might get excited about the idea of a feast, a banquet, a break in the culinary boredom, a celebration, except no, because medieval feasts for the common people were like sales at an expensive store. You heard about them, but you never participated. Most peasants only ate something different during holy days. And even then, different was a strong word. In practice, it meant maybe a piece of meat, bread with more flour than tree bark, and if the stars aligned, a sweet made of fermented fruit. That is, if the feudal lord had mercy and was drunk and charitable and preferably unconscious. These special occasions were accompanied by a lot of prayer, guilt, and a list of dietary restrictions worthy of a gastronomic reality show. Because the Catholic Church had a dietary schedule as detailed as a modern fad diet, just without the Instagram posts. During Lent, for example, meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed. So, people hunted anything that swam, crawled, or had scales. Eels, frogs, mollusks. If it lived in water, it became protein for the occasion. Some religious orders even authorized beaver because, according to the very serious reasoning of theologians at the time, the beaver spent so much time in the water, it was practically a fish. Medieval logic, don't try to understand it. Besides that, there were the fasts, Real fasts. None of this intermittent stuff. This was 24 hours with only bread and water, if you were lucky. In some cases, not even that. The idea was to purify the soul. What it really purified was any desire to live. During these sanctified meals, the food was a reminder that pleasure was a sin. If it tasted good, it was already grounds for suspicion. So, the meals were made with the minimum possible seasoning, cooked until they became an amorphous mass, and served in silence. It was the gastronomic Netflix of the Middle Ages, repetitive, dark, and with no plot twists. But what about the nobles? The nobles. They had real banquets, with game meat, stuffed pies, white bread, dried fruits, diverse cheeses and wine. But don't be fooled. Even among the rich, food was a test of intestinal endurance. The dishes came decorated with feathers, skins, and even heads, because presenting the entire animal on the table was considered elegant. Eating pheasant? Chic. Eating pheasant with its head still on the plate, staring at you? Sophisticated. And the sweets covered in sugar and edible gold. Yes, gold. Because if there's one thing that goes well with rotting teeth, it's precious metal. Oh, and the sauces, a show in themselves. Made with a mix of vinegar, almonds, sugar, dried fruits and spices expensive enough to finance a small coup. And what if the food spoiled? Simple. Cover it with sauce, add more spices, hide the taste, and serve it anyway. Because waste was a crime, literally. Some fiefdoms punished those who threw food away, even if it was green, slimy, and speaking Latin. And to drink, of course, wine. Claudia, unfiltered, with bits floating in it. Because yes, it was wine with texture. Meanwhile, in the village, the peasant ate dry oat bread, drank warm beer, and dreamed of a day when dinner wouldn't taste like regret. But he knew that day wouldn't come. Not in the Middle Ages. Not as long as the pigs were better fed than the people. In the end, even the feasts tasted like defeat. You finished dinner, or at least stopped chewing the hard pieces your brain identified as food. But maybe you're curious now. How was all this prepared? Where was the kitchen? Who performed this reverse alchemy that transformed sad ingredients into even worse dishes? The short answer: it was made wherever it fit. In peasant homes, the kitchen was simply the corner of the only available room. A hole in the floor with embers. A few stones around it, an iron pot hanging over it, and a lot of faith that it wouldn't turn into a fire. Which, by the way, happened frequently. Accidental fires were more common than good dinners, because the wooden house, the thatched roof, and the boiling oil formed the perfect trio of culinary chaos. The stove, as you know it, didn't exist. Neither did the oven. What existed was a circle of fire on the ground, and a pot that was already there when you were born, and would still be there when you died. It was passed down from generation to generation as if it were a relic. A pot with more history than your family tree. The lighting, the light from the flame, and that's it. No windows, no ventilation, no exhaust fan. Cooking was an act of faith. And smoke, so much smoke. So much that in some houses, the ceiling was permanently dark. The soot accumulated as if it were decoration. Breathing in that environment, an involuntary pulmonary workout. Now imagine cooking in there. You trying to light the fire with damp wood, coughing into the embers, while the family chicken defecates in the corner and a rat crosses your peripheral vision. Romantic, isn't it? And don't think the utensils helped. The spoon was wooden. The fork didn't exist. The knife was dull, and the plate was optional. Sometimes the stale bread served as the plate. Yes, it was hard enough to hold the food. You ate the food off the bread, and then you ate the plate. Zero waste, maximum embarrassment. Food preservation was also creative. Salting, smoking, burying in ashes. Refrigerator, of course not. If you wanted something to last, you sprinkled salt on it until it looked like a sculpture. The result was meat so salty it made you thirsty just looking at it. Some houses had a cauldron hanging over the fire where everything was thrown, literally everything. Bones, roots, old bread, vegetable peels, leftovers from past dinners. It was like a continuous soup, a sort of infinite broth that lasted for weeks. You just kept adding to it, but you never cleaned it. The bottom of that pot was a time capsule, an archaeological record of malnutrition. And when someone visited, what did you do? Served them a bit of this eternal broth. Medieval hospitality was basically giving someone a sample of every meal from the previous week in the form of hot slop. Now, if you were a noble, your kitchen was bigger, but it was also a walking hazard. Castles had kitchens with immense fires, servants running around with boiling cauldrons, cats hunting rats on the countertops, and cooks with teeth so bad that chewing was just a metaphor. The ingredients were more varied, but the chaos was the same. In fact, many castles caught fire because of the kitchen, literally. It was common for dinner to end in tragedy, because fire, grease, lack of ventilation, and drunk cooks were never a good combination. And to finish, hygiene. The word didn't even exist. Washing your hands was considered fussy. The meat was cut with the same knife used to trim a moustache. And the dishes were cleaned with a cloth of doubt, an old rag that just spread the grime around with elegance. So yes, the medieval kitchen was the heart of the home, a dirty, hot, smoky, and slightly explosive heart. But at least it had food, or something like it. The moment has arrived when the body cries out for something sweet, a reward, a treat, a sign that living isn't just dragging invisible chains while chewing turnips on a loop. In short, it's time for dessert. But in the Middle Ages, dessert was a word that seemed to exist only to make you angry. Because among the peasants, dessert wasn't a routine. It was a legend, a myth, a sweet mirage in the desert of unfermented carbohydrates. If you wanted something that remotely resembled a sweet, you had to depend on nature and luck. Wild berries, when they appeared, were consumed on the spot. No ceremony, no whipped cream, no Instagram, just a quick bite before they rotted. Because preservation? Not yet, young Padawan. Sugar, on the other hand, was a mythological creature, imported, rare, extremely expensive. It was worth more than gold. Literally, a small jar of sugar could be equivalent to a cow, and a cow gave milk. Sugar only gave you cavities, and still the rich preferred sugar. Priorities. And honey? Yes, there was honey, but it was also treated like a relic, guarded, hidden, used sparingly. A spoonful of honey could be a wedding present or payment for a service. And since it was harvested straight from the hive, with no special suit, no smoker, no concept of danger, getting honey was practically an extreme sport. So what was served as dessert among the most humble? Things that today would be called artisanal small batch porridges, by people who pay a lot to eat gourmet suffering. A classic example, oatmeal gruel with a touch of salt, and if the heavens opened, a single drop of honey. This was considered a luxury, a spoon sweet that scraped the throat like wet sand, but sweetened the spirit. Another favorite, pies filled with dried fruit. When dried fruit existed, which in reality were just fruits forgotten in the sun, one dried apricot was already cause for celebration. Apple pie? Maybe. If someone had apples, an oven, time, and the willpower not to eat everything before baking it. But among the nobles, the game was different. Desserts became a weapon of ostentation. There were almond tarts, cakes decorated with sculpted sugar, caramelized fruits, and even marzipan sculptures in the shape of animals, castles, or saints. It was like an episode of Baroque competitive baking with questionable taste. But plot twist, even in the desserts of the rich, the flavor was, let's say, questionable. Pure sugar was so rare that they often used honey or mashed dates to sweeten things. And when they did use real sugar, they exaggerated so much that the sweet turned to cement. The dentists of the time were grateful. Just kidding. There were no dentists, And the famous dragées, sweet balls covered in silver, literally, eating metal was chic. Nobody knew it was bad for you. If it sparkled, it was worthy. But what about chocolate? You are centuries too early. Chocolate was still a secret of the Americas. In medieval Europe, nobody had any idea this would one day exist. The most you'd get was warm wine with spices and honey. It was served at the end of meals as a digestive or as liquid punishment. And if you were a monk, then yes, maybe you had access to sweets made in the monasteries. Monks were the first medieval confectioners. They made honey cakes, sweet bread with fruit, ceremonial biscuits, but of course only on religious dates, and always with a long prayer beforehand, because pleasure without guilt never. So yes, dessert existed, but not as you imagine it. It was scarce, hard, dry, and often made with the same flour as the morning's bread, just with more resignation. And even so, people ate it with their eyes closed, because anything that wasn't lukewarm broth and old bread was already considered a miracle. Let's assume that you, against all odds, have eaten. You finish the bowl of potage with carrot fragments from the last century, scraped the hard bread against your gums, and even took that final gulp of thin beer. Now comes the part that nobody mentions in history class. What happens next? Medieval digestion was an act of courage. The common peasant's digestive system was a mix of intestine, luck, and acquired resistance. Remember the salted meat, the fermented fish, the overcooked vegetables, and the bread with sawdust? Well, all of that is now in your stomach, fighting for space and meaning. The immediate result? Gas. Lots of gas. Medieval flatulence wasn't a taboo. It was part of daily life. The small, enclosed houses with no ventilation became virtual biological hothouses after dinner. Nobody commented. Everyone just pretended nothing happened, even when the smell was so thick you could bite the air. And it wasn't just the smell. It was the sound, loud, frequent, and inevitable. It was as if the intestines made a point of protesting against everything that had been ingested. Now imagine sleeping with that, in an enclosed space with 6 people, a goat, and 0 air circulation. The fermentation was collective, sleep was uncertain. But worse than the gas was the rebellious intestine. Diarrhea was so common that nobody saw it as a disease. It was just part of life, an unpredictable digestive routine that meant peasants always had a small bucket nearby or a specific corner behind the house. The problem? There was no concept of hygiene after the event. At most, a handful of straw and a desperate prayer. If you think dealing with food poisoning once a year is bad, think about the common medieval person. They lived in a constant low-level state of poisoning. The meat might be a bit grey, the cheese with personality, the bread with fungus, and the fish. Well, if it moved on its own, that was extra protein. But like everything in the Middle Ages, they survived on a basis of resignation. Except the body didn't always hold up. Intestinal infections were fatal and fast. One day you had a stomachache. The next day you were being buried with a coin in your mouth and a piece of cloth covering your face. Cause of death: unbalanced humors, according to the experts of the time. Translation: bad food and 0 sanitation. And the doctors, those who came with leeches, prayers and diagnoses based on the stars, they tried to help. They offered herbal infusions, boiled wine, or purgatives. Yes, the idea was to cleanse the body from the inside. The result: more diarrhea. Congratulations. And if the pain was unbearable, you took a swig of hard liquor, or you were tied down while they removed some part that seemed to be possessed. Surgery without anesthesia because the stomach hurt, but the healer's sadism hurt more. Now think, all of this because of a piece of poorly preserved cheese. This is why, in the Middle Ages, the fear of food was real. People ate because they had to, but never with 100% confidence. What we call comfort food today, back then was attempted unintentional homicide. And still, Everyone kept eating, because to stop meant dying faster. The irony, sometimes eating also led to the same end, while the common folk were starving, burping up potage, and chewing on bread that tasted like clay. The medieval elite were in another world, a world of castles, tapestries, live music with out-of-tune instrument, and banquets. The banquets, the promise of culinary glamour, exotic meats, impossible pies, and wine spilled in golden cups. But the reality, as always in the Middle Ages, was closer to a greasy nightmare. Let's take it in parts. Literally, the royal meal began with parades. Yes, parades. The food was brought in procession. Servants marched, carrying silver platters covered with fine cloths, announcing each dish as if it were a divine revelation. And the dish, a boar's head, decorated with an apple in its mouth and a frozen smile of terror. Beside it, pies stuffed with everything. Literally, everything. Pigeon meat, quail eggs, pork fat, apricots, cloves, cinnamon, and if it was fancy, pieces of another animal that nobody could identify. It was the famous noble mixture, a dish that seemed to have been created in a fit of fever and privilege. Presentation was an art. It wasn't enough to cook, you had to sculpt. Swans were roasted, then redressed in their own feathers and served reconstituted, as if they were still alive. The effect was beautiful. The taste was compensated for with a lot of sauce. And the sauce was the life of the party. Made with sweet wines, spices, dried fruits, fat, flour, blood. Yes, blood. Because nothing says high cuisine like a touch of hemoglobin in your plum gravy. The most curious part, many of these dishes weren't meant to be eaten. They were just for show. Yes, a considerable part of the banquet was made just to impress. A kind of medieval Instagram. You looked, but you didn't touch. And when you finally could eat, it wasn't simple. There were no forks. The use of the fork would only become popular much later. Eating was a manual, collective, greasy act. Etiquette dictated that nobles should use only 3 fingers, as if that made any difference. The tablecloth became a napkin. The dog itself sat at the owner's feet waiting for scraps. Sometimes it didn't even wait. It just jumped on the table. And that was that. Dessert came later. Candied fruits, cakes with more sugar than structure, pies filled with suspicious creams, and figures made of sweet dough in the shape of saints, dragons, or sins, all decorated with edible gold. Because when your teeth are already halfway gone, there's nothing like covering them with precious metal. And the wine, the wine, served by the liter, cloudy, acidic, strong, mixed with spices or sweetened with honey. Sometimes it was just sour, but nobody cared, because the goal was stupor, digestion, and adventure. The banquets lasted for hours, sometimes days. People got sick, they vomited between courses. They had servants dedicated to helping with this. It was socially acceptable. Eating until you collapsed was a sign of wealth, of power, and also of foolishness. And when the banquet ended, the party began. Dancing, games, and, of course, more food. Because if there's one thing the medieval elite did well, it was ignoring the fact that the people outside were eating plain turnips with a wisp of dignity. So, yes, there were banquets, there was luxury, but there was also the smell of rancid grease, undercooked meat, and dessert made by monks with inflated egos. It was opulence. It was decadence. It was the Middle Ages trying to compensate for a lack of hygiene with an excess of food. Spoiler, it didn't work. You, who grew up with a thermal lunchbox, a juice box, and a cream-filled cookie. I'm sorry, but in the Middle Ages, none of that existed. The medieval childhood was an accelerated stage heading toward adult misery, with no right to recess, cartoons, or an afternoon snack. Because a child in the Middle Ages didn't snack. They worked. They cried. They ate the leftovers of leftovers. And they were grateful. In silence, of course, because a child who talked too much got slapped. What would a snack be for a peasant child? Maybe, with luck, a piece of dried-out bread forgotten on the shelf, or a cold spoonful of gruel stolen from their mother's bowl. Sometimes a small, raw turnip, which they held onto as if it was Snow White's apple, only without the beauty or the magic, just the bad taste. Fruits, only if they fell from a tree by accident and nobody saw, because fruit was an item of dispute, of fights, of family conflict. One apple could cause an unofficial divorce, a ripe pear. Well, that was grounds for war between siblings. Now, if the child was from a noble family, the situation changed a little. Not that the snack was healthy, but it was more symbolic. Flour cakes with honey, dried, chewable fruits, and occasionally a small piece of cheese that was already a bit green, but was considered cured, a word that at the time just meant not dead yet. These privileged children had nannies or wet nurses who fed them, sometimes literally pre-chewing the food before passing it into the child's mouth. Love? No. That's just how they knew how to do it. And the result was always the same. Children with teeth growing into mouths already contaminated by 3 centuries of hereditary bacteria. The lack of food variety meant that children's palates were trained the hard way. Cried because you didn't want to eat sour gruel. You get 2 servings. Complained about the salty fish. Now you'll chew it, bones and all. The logic was clear. Hunger teaches. And it really does. It teaches you to eat fast without thinking and to swallow before someone steals it from your hand. And of course there was the constant fear of food-related illnesses, worms, diarrhea, fevers. Children died from everything. Eating something spoiled wasn't an accident. It was a statistic. If a child survived to age 5, they were already considered victorious. Getting a new tooth and not immediately losing it was a family achievement. Oh, and forget powdered milk, formula, or industrialized baby food. Babies were breastfed or given goat's milk, sometimes from dirty cloths, soaked and squeezed into their mouths. Nutrition was trial and error, and usually more error than trial. And when the teeth came in, there was no celebration. There was a shock, because now the child could bite, and that was dangerous in any social class. School lunch? Only if you consider lunch a sliver of bread, and school a monk hitting you with a rod because you got the Latin wrong. Spoiler, you were going to get the Latin wrong. In short, the medieval snack time was an invisible moment, a pause that didn't happen, an interval between hunger and despair. Eating between meals was a privilege, heresy, or a sign of gluttony. And gluttony was a sin, because, of course, in the midst of widespread malnutrition, the church still managed to turn the desire for food into a moral failure. The medieval child didn't have snack time, they had survival time. And even so, many of them grew up with nutritional deficiencies, weak bones, impaired vision, and teeth the size of corn kernels. But technically, they were alive. In the Middle Ages, health was a vague concept, vague and fragile, and the idea that food could cure illness was popular, even if the cure involved ingesting substances that would make a modern pharmacist lose their license in 3 seconds. The medieval medicinal diet was based on the 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A system that made about as much sense as trying to cure a headache with poetry. But that's what they used, literally. If you coughed, it was blamed on excess phlegm. If you were sad, it was black bile. And all of this was treated with food, or rather, with weird versions of food. Let's start with broths. Everything started with a good, nutritious broth, made with meat, when available, roots, herbs, and an alarming amount of garlic. Garlic was the universal remedy. Stomachache, garlic; fever, garlic; dog bite, garlic; evil spirit, more garlic. It was practically a religion. Another popular remedy was the medicinal panada, bread soaked in hot spiced wine, because clearly nothing is better than mixing fermented bread with boiled wine and expecting it to solve a urinary tract infection. Spoiler, it didn't. And when the subject was stomach problems, common given the medieval menu, the recommendation was to eat charcoal. Yes, ground vegetable charcoal mixed with honey, because, according to the doctors of the time, the charcoal absorbed the bad vapors. What it really absorbed was your will to live. Other favorites of the kitchen healers included blood soup, fresh animal blood heated with herbs to strengthen the body or traumatize the patient, an infusion of pigeon droppings. Yes, you read that right. Dried, ground and mixed with wine, prescribed for certain fevers. It also served to lose friends quickly. Pastes of pork fat with herbs applied to the skin or ingested, because apparently everything was food if you just closed your eyes. Oh, and sweets also had their role. Comfits, seeds or herbs covered in sugar were used as digestives. But since sugar was a luxury item, they were rare. When someone offered you a comfit, you knew you were being cured with care, or that the person wanted something in return. Even drinks entered the game. Wines infused with roots, fortified vinegars, beers with questionable ingredients. Drinking one of these potions was an act of faith and risk, simultaneously. But in general, medicinal food was more frightening than effective. There was no concept of dosage, no microbiological knowledge. What there was trial, error, superstition, and a touch of involuntary sadism. And the worst part, some of these cures were mandatory. If the village healer said you needed a broth of frog liver cooked with onion, you drank it, because refusing was considered disrespect for ancient knowledge or heresy, and nobody wanted to be a heretic in an era when burning people was a social event. In the end, the concept of "you are what you eat" made sense, because most people were just a collection of yeast, garlic, and despair. Eating as medicine. In the Middle Ages, that was practically a death sentence, with an aroma of marjoram. Today, when you think of a snack, you might picture a fancy charcuterie board. Some nice cheeses, an olive, maybe even nachos with guacamole. But in the Middle Ages, a snack wasn't a luxury. It was bad luck. The concept of nibbling on something between meals existed. Only the nibbling was literal, because what you ate as an appetizer was so small, hard, or weird that it required the technique of tweezers and sheer force of will. Let's start with the classic, nuts. Yes, those existed. Almonds, hazelnuts, real walnuts. But only if you lived near the trees, knew how to harvest them, and managed to crack the shell without breaking your teeth. The only advantage, they provided energy. The disadvantage, cracked teeth and a tired jaw. Another frequent snack, toasted seeds. Grains of barley, wheat, or rye. Roasted until they were hard enough to serve as a snack or ammunition. The line between a snack and a medieval weapon was thin, and if you wanted something sweet, there were dried fruits. If, of course, you had access to them. Drying fruit was a form of preservation, but also a subtle form of dental torture. You bit into a dried fig with the same emotion you'd chew on flavored rubber, and still, it was sought after. The poor made their own snacks from leftovers. Strips of bread baked until they turned to stone, pieces of hardened cheese, or the most popular among the desperate, dried vegetable peels with salt. That is, when salt wasn't a luxury item, of course. And the nobles. The nobles snacked with style. Comfits, those sugar-coated seeds we mentioned earlier, were a favorite. Coriander seeds, fennel or anise, wrapped in layers of sugar, which for a change could break a tooth. But they were fragrant, very chic, served in little golden boxes as if they were edible jewelry. Another castle treat, pieces of cured meat, served cold, thinly sliced, like prosciutto, only more rustic, drier, and more likely to provoke an infinite thirst. If you snacked on 3 slices, you needed 2 liters of wine afterward, and a confessor. Furthermore, the rich had the peculiar habit of snacking on smoked bird tongues. Yes, smoked bird tongues were considered a delicacy. What they really were, tiny, hard pieces that tasted like nothing and had the texture of panic. And of course, all of this was accompanied by a drink. A snack without a drink was considered rude. But the drinks, well, we'll get back to that shortly. Returning to the snacks, you know that moment in the afternoon when you open the cupboard and say, "I need something to nibble on." In the medieval world, that moment was dangerous. Opening the cupboard, if you even had one, meant facing crumbs, a furry piece of cheese, a browned apple, or a rat already nibbling for you. The truth is, nobody ate snacks for pleasure. They ate because the stomach was making noise. Dinner was far away, and the bread was, sometimes, still chewable. And travelers carried improvised snacks, dried meat, biscuits as hard as roofing tiles, and little balls of animal fat mixed with oats, the superfoods of the era. Nutritious, yes. Edible, in theory. So yes, there were snacks. There was nibbling. There were quick bites between one miserable task and another, but nobody smiled while they chewed. It was just the stomach screaming, "Just fool me for 2 minutes, please," and the brain replying, "This is all we have." Today you have silverware for everything. Butter knife, dessert spoon, fondue fork, cheese spatula. But in the Middle Ages, life was more direct. The rule was simple. If you had a spoon and your fingers worked, you could live and eat, more or less. Let's start with the star of the era, the spoon. It was the only universal utensil. Made of wood, sometimes bone, rarely metal, and usually unique. Each person had their own, carried it everywhere. And if they lost it, they basically went into mourning. In some families, the spoon was inherited, a symbol of status, of organized misery. The fork, forget it. It existed in very noble circles, and even then, with only 2 tines. Used more as a serving tool than for eating, the fork was considered unnecessary, strange, even immoral. There were actual debates about this. Introducing a trident into one's food. One clergyman even said it was an offense to divine creation. In other words, if you tried to use a fork, you'd probably get a sermon. The knife, on the other hand, was a personal item. You carried your own, used it for everything. Cutting meat, bread, rope, your beard, your nails, and then you ate with it. Cleaning was conceptual. Wiped it on my pants, it's good as new. And the plates weren't individual. Most meals were eaten from communal boards, shared bowls, or, for the nobles, on thick slices of old bread called trenchers. Yes. The bread functioned as a plate. You ate off of it, and then you ate it. At the end of dinner, the plate became dessert, and if they didn't eat it, it was given to the poor. A plate already licked, chewed by the eyes of those who served it. In peasant houses, the most common plate was a clay bowl, heavy, chipped and passed among family members. On bad days, red, all of them. One single bowl fed 4 or 5 people. With every spoonful, a moment of tension. Will there be any left for me? Cups were rare. Drinking from the spout of the cask or straight from a ladle was common. Among the nobles, there were goblets of pewter, silver or gold, which of course came with the added bonus of heavy metal poisoning, chic and lethal. Napkins only existed at royal weddings. What people really used was their sleeve, their apron, or the tablecloth, sometimes all at once. And if you were smart, you wiped your hand on your own dog. It was multi-purpose, companionship, cleaning and food safety. Literally, it ate whatever fell. Table etiquette was also creative. Rules included, do not put your fingers in the bowl up to the elbow, or do not pick up meat with hands dirtied by your nose. The standards were low, the contamination level extremely high. Among monks, meals were taken in silence. which, considering the intestinal sounds of a medieval diet, was almost cruel. A symphony of bellies betraying their owners. And what about the banquets? Guests sat side by side, eating from the same platter, using their own knives and fingers. Spilling food on the table was expected. Eating fast was necessary, because everything ran out in minutes, and what was left went straight to the servants, the animals, or the trash, when that luxury existed. And cleaning the kitchen afterward, there were no dish towels, no soap as we know it, just water, sand, and resignation. Scrubbing with sand was the official method, and letting it dry in the sun, or not. A black pot was a sign of use. A crust of months was respected. So if today you complain about the dishes piling up, remember that in the Middle Ages you used bread as a plate, wiped your mouth on your sleeve, and still considered it progress. Spoiler, it wasn't. And today your kitchen is a clean space, with a refrigerator, a microwave, and at most, a cat observing you judgmentally. In the Middle Ages it was a mix of a zoo, a black market, and an olfactory horror theatre. All at once, all sweaty. Because, you see, the animals didn't stay outside the house. They were part of the house, part of the environment, the furniture, the routine, and eventually, the menu. Let's start with the chickens. The celebrities of the medieval kitchen. They weren't in an isolated coop. They were right there, in the corner of the kitchen, pecking at crumbs, scratching near the fire, and laying eggs wherever they pleased, sometimes on your bed, sometimes, accidentally or not, inside the pot. And they weren't pets, they were food. Eggs, meat, feathers, everything was used. But until the day of their beheading, they lived as part of the family, a noisy, dirty part that left warm little reminders on the floor. Then came the pigs. Ah, the pigs, the walking repositories of scraps. If you had a pig, you had a living garbage disposal. They ate everything, peels, bones, spoiled food, old shoes, and according to persistent rumors, even people. Yes, there were stories of pigs devouring entire corpses, which made them useful and slightly terrifying animals. But the most common thing was to have a pig loose in the village, doing whatever it wanted. It would enter houses, knock over pots, sleep near the fire. It was basically the cat of the era, only bigger, smellier, and potentially homicidal. Other kitchen frequenters included dogs, not as pampered pets, but as the post-meal cleanup crew. They licked the plates, the hands, and anything that fell on the floor. They were the final stage of hygiene. Cats were rat hunters with sacred status. An efficient cat could mean fewer plagues and more uncontaminated food. They were valued, perhaps too much. In some places, stealing a cat was a crime punishable by a fine paid in bread. Rats, inevitable, always present, always audacious. They chewed the bread, swam in the cauldrons, scratched the cheeses. Sometimes they were caught and eaten, because protein is protein, and desperation has no aesthetic. Goats, especially among the peasants, they lived with the family. Gave milk, sometimes companionship, and from time to time kicked your plate, but that was okay. The sour milk made up for it, and when it came time to sacrifice an animal, guess where it was done? That's right, in the kitchen, or just outside, but very close. Blood running, feathers flying, screams, a true sensory festival. The medieval kitchen wasn't just the place for food, it was the place for pre-food and for trauma. This hygienic separation between living and cooking didn't exist. Everything was one big cauldron of functions. The corner where you slept was the same one where the chicken laid its eggs. The place where you boiled the gruel was the same one where the pig drooled. And so among feathers, fur and paws, the day's food was made, with lots of animal help, voluntary or not. So the next time your cat jumps on the counter, remember, it could be a pig. You're tired. You've worked all day hoeing the earth with a bent tool, fighting off rats, and harvesting onions with a sore back. Naturally you think, I'm not cooking tonight. I'm going to eat out. a treat, a luxury, a quick escape. And then, of course, you remember you're in the Middle Ages. Because in the Middle Ages, eating out was a concept as distant as Wi-Fi. The options were, let's say, limited. First, because if you were a peasant, your village didn't even have a tavern. And if it did, it wasn't the type that served nice plates with Latin names. It was the type where you walk in, step in something strange, and hope you don't leave with fleas or an infection. The tavern, when it existed, was a mix of a bar, a boarding house, and a shack. A dark, stinking place where the wine was served warm and the bread was hard enough to be used as a weapon. There was a large cauldron bubbling near the fire, and nobody knew exactly what was in it, only that it was stew, always. It was the same stew every day, with slight variations in texture and sometimes in the number of insects floating on top. And even so, it was better than eating at home, because there, you could share the trauma with strangers. You could listen to a drunk troubadour singing about plagues and romantic disappointments. You could watch someone get thrown out for not paying the bill, which, by the way, was often paid with eggs, promises, or in extreme cases, a piglet. The atmosphere was lively, in the worst sense of the word. Too many people packed together, coughing, spitting on the floor, laughing loudly, burping without guilt. It was the place where the lower classes gathered to pretend they weren't sick. Eating and drinking there was an act of courage and also of escape, not from routine, but from one's own stomach. If you were more affluent, you might find an establishment with refined dishes, which were nothing more than the same mistreated ingredients, just served with a clean cloth on the table, sometimes, and charged as if they had been harvested in paradise. The wine was the same, sour, cloudy, suspicious, but it came in a pitcher with a coat of arms, which didn't improve the taste, but it did increase the status. And if you wanted something really different, like fresh bread or decent meat, you were better off looking for a monastery. That's right. The monks knew how to cook. Some even maintained small guest houses with passable meals, but everything came with that vibe of penance, eating in silence, praying before, during, and after, chewing with guilt. Dessert was a sermon. Oh, and there was no menu, no choosing your dish. You ate what they had. Asking, "What's in the stew today?" was an offense. The answer was usually just a look of contempt, and a ladleful being served directly onto your cracked wooden plate. Asking for takeaway was even more offensive. To go meant wrapping the bread in a dirty cloth and carrying it in your pocket. Delivery? Yes. If you were very rich and had servants, they would go to the kitchen, get the food, and bring it to you. Usually already cold, and with a piece missing, because nibbling on the way was considered an unofficial rite of transport. So, yes, there were ways to eat out, but the experience was anything but gastronomic. It was sensory. It was sociological. It was the kind of thing that made you grateful to have teeth or regret still having them, depending on the dish of the day. And still, people went back to the same place, the same stew, the same smell. Because in the end, eating out wasn't about the food. It was about escaping the house, escaping yourself, and maybe, just maybe, forgetting for a few minutes that next week's dinner would be dry bread with wind. If you finished eating your piece of fossilized bread and your bowl of questionable broth, you'll naturally want something to drink. A glass of water, perhaps. Forget it. Water was considered public enemy number one. Drinking clean water was as rare as finding someone who knew their own birth date, because most of the water, rivers, wells, streams, came seasoned with feces, dead animals, and the remnants of very poor urban planning decisions. Therefore, the average medieval person preferred anything else, literally, any liquid that wasn't water. And that's where fermented beverages come in, a category as broad as it was risky, because deep down, everything was homemade by someone who swore they knew what they were doing. but probably didn't. Beer was omnipresent, but forget that artisanal IPA with imported hops and dense foam. The beer of the time was thin, weak, cloudy, and almost always warm. It had no carbonation, no glamour, and sometimes no taste of anything. But it had one advantage: it was less deadly than the water. So yes, everyone drank it. Men, women, children. Beer was the juice box of the Middle Ages. There was also mead, a mixture of honey, water, and yeast, ideal for parties, celebrations, and for forgetting what you ate for supper. It was sweeter, stronger, and more treacherous. 1 mug made you happy. 2 put you on the table dancing. 3 left you in the barn, hugging a goat, calling it your long-lost love. Wine was also part of the routine, especially in the southern regions of Europe. But here's the sad detail. Medieval wine wasn't this refined nectar you see in bottles with corks. It was more like grape juice that gave up on life. Acidic, unpredictable, frequently mixed with water to make it last, or with honey, spices, or, in moments of desperation, pieces of bread. Which leads us to a much appreciated invention: hot, spiced wine, a medicine and a beverage at the same time. It was used for everything: colds, melancholy, uncomfortable meetings. The taste: a clash between clove, cinnamon, vinegar, and a slight hint of regret. The monks, of course, had their own recipes: herbal drinks, liqueurs with Latin names that promised to cure the soul and destroy the liver. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they just gave you visions. One monk wrote that after drinking one of these elixirs, he spoke to an angel for 4 hours. Spoiler, it was the chicken in the courtyard. And for the most desperate, there were the primitive aqua vitae, or spirits. Improvised distillates made from barley, potatoes, or anything that would ferment and not explode in the process. They were consumed by few and feared by all. 1 swig could give you courage or stop your heart. It was liquid lottery. Curiously, nobody found this strange. Being slightly intoxicated was part of daily life. It made life more bearable. It disguised the taste of the food. And in the case of many medieval recipes, it was the only way to disinfect the organism before going to sleep. So, yes, you drank all the time. But not to toast to life. You drank because the water was dangerous, the wine was acidic, and lucidity was a burden. And because deep down, being sober in the Middle Ages was an invitation to despair. You decide to take a look at the kitchen, or rather, what the Middle Ages insisted on calling a kitchen. Modern expectations might include a countertop, a stove, a window, but there, what you find is a dark, damp room with an eternally lit fireplace, spitting smoke into every corner except the chimney. The air is dense, not that poetic density of cold mornings, but a physical, palpable density, full of grease and charcoal. Your eyes burn before you even step into the room. And the smell, an immortal mixture of burnt onion, wet ash, and a subtle hint of an anxious rat. In the center, of course, is the cauldron, the star of the show, a black, immense container hanging over the embers. Inside, a liquid that nobody knows exactly where it came from or where it's going. It's the potage of the week. Every day someone adds something: a potato here, a cabbage leaf there, a chicken wing that's already a bit grey, maybe a handful of barley that fell on the floor. The contents are never thrown out, only transformed. It evolves or regresses, depending on your point of view. The heat from the fire makes the room unbearable, but strangely, the walls are always damp. The grease from cooking sticks to everything, to the ceiling, the walls, the hair of anyone who dares to enter. Nothing in there is dry. Everything has a sticky texture, its own olfactory memory. And the utensils, iron pots that weigh as much as a curse, wooden spoons with more cracks than functional value, cutting boards that look like archaeological relics. Everything is grimy. Everything has a thin crust that, they say, is flavor. The windows, when they exist, are too small to allow ventilation, but just large enough to let in flies. Flies that seem to have made the kitchen their official capital. They hover over the soup, land on the bread, bounce off the sweaty foreheads of those cooking, and emerge unharmed. As if they know that in here they are at the top of the food chain. The floor is packed earth, or mud, depending on the season. In winter, slippery, in summer, dusty, but always dirty. Crumbs, feathers, peels, bones, charcoal, and if you're lucky, only that. Because the corner of the kitchen also serves as an improvised latrine, when dignity leaves along with the last turnip. And who is cooking? Someone with tired eyes, burnt hands, and greasy clothes. Someone who knows deep down that no matter how hard they try, they will never please. Because the food in there isn't made for pleasure. It's made for sustenance, a heroic effort to transform sad ingredients into something that won't kill you immediately. The lighting, a candle, or the flame from the fireplace itself. The shadows dance on the walls, creating the illusion of movement where there is only exhaustion, and at any moment the ceiling might drop soot or simply collapse, as if it too has given up. Even so, the kitchen is the heart of the home, the place where everyone meets, grumbles, argues, and waits for the next spoonful of the eternal broth. It's where the day begins, ends, and drags on in the middle. There is no silence there. Just the constant sound of boiling wood crackling and someone saying, "That's good enough." And when you finally get out of there, carrying your steaming bowl, you realize the smell of the kitchen follows you, ingrained in your clothes, your hair, your soul. An aromatic souvenir of the experience. In the Middle Ages, cooking wasn't an art. It was resistance. Imagine the end of a long day. You survived the stew, ignored the smell of the kitchen, and now you're dreaming of something sweet, a treat, a prize, a piece of happiness that tastes like sugar. And then the Middle Ages looks at you and says, "Good luck with that." Because sugar in the medieval world was practically a myth. It was rare, expensive, and for a long time treated more as a medicine than a culinary ingredient. When it did appear, it came in hard, dark blocks, looking like building materials. Only the very rich could afford the luxury of using sugar in desserts. The rest of the population relied on alternative options. The sweetness of the common people came from honey, but not that crystal-clear supermarket honey. This was a thick honey, with pieces of wax, an occasional forgotten bee, and the taste of a tired plant. Even so, it was the official sweetener of rural life. It was used to spread on bread, to mix into gruel, or to disguise the taste of a fruit that was already emotionally expired. Fruits, by the way, were a gamble. When they were good, they were a divine gift. When they were past their prime, they became compote, or something like compote, only made on the fire, without measurements, without timing, and with a dash of chaos. Pears cooked in wine, apples mashed with cinnamon when available, or figs boiled until they lost the will to live. All of this served as dessert, and nobody complained, because complaining required energy and sugar. For the rich, it was a different story. They had access to exotic ingredients, dates, raisins, caramelized almonds, pastries filled with dried fruits and eggs beaten into a foam that lasted 2 minutes before collapsing, but it was still considered a luxury. They also made sweet pastries with fillings that ranged from improvised jam to meat paste with sugar. Yes, the line between savory and sweet was blurred, confusing, a constant experiment. One of the emblematic sweets of the elite was the famous blancmange, a kind of pudding made with milk, rice, sugar, and sometimes shredded chicken. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't savory. It was just weird, and it served as a status symbol. Eating it was a way of saying, "I'm so rich I can put poultry in my pudding and no one will laugh." Another favorite was the spice cake, a hard mass made of flour, honey, pepper, cinnamon, and clove. One bite was enough to lock your jaw for 3 days, But since it smelled good, it was offered at parties, weddings, and social rituals, where appearance mattered more than taste. And when all else failed, there was the old trick of bread with honey. Warm, if possible, mashed with dried fruits, or simply left by the fire until it acquired the consistency of food. It was the ideal end to the night, chewing slowly, forgetting the other flavors of the day, and hoping to wake up with your teeth still in place. The truth is, medieval dessert wasn't about pleasure. It was about a pause, a brief moment where the palate tried to regain its dignity before the next plate of pickled cabbage. And so, between caked honey and chicken pudding, the people of the Middle Ages dreamed of a sweeter world. A world where sugar wasn't rarer than taking a bath. A world where, maybe one day, it would be possible to finish a meal with a genuine smile. Spoiler, that world was still far away, but at least the honey came with a natural fiber. You've just eaten. Your stomach is full of yesterday's bread, meat of dubious origin, a soup that seemed to have its own memories, and maybe a bit of hardened honey. Now all you want is to lie down, breathe deep, and let your body do the rest. But your medieval body has other plans. Because digestion back then was a kind of survival ritual. There were no antacids. There was no sympathy. There was just you, the internal noises, and the hope of not dying from the inside. Literally. The medicine of the time had a very nice theory. Digestion was a kind of internal cooking. The body acted like a small oven, heating the food, breaking it into smaller parts, and distributing it through invisible channels, full of common sense and harmony. Too bad none of that actually happened. The most common outcome was the food simply stopping there, sitting heavily, fermenting, emitting distress signals that came in the form of timid burps or, when least expected, a full-blown episode of gastrointestinal regret. The side effects varied according to the menu. If you ate too much dry bread, the sensation was of a stomach made of stone. If it was very fatty meat, immediate drowsiness would set in, followed by a persistent discomfort. If wine was involved, deep sleep. But the dreams, well, let's just say the mix of goat liver and fermented alcohol tended to produce visions that Freud would have loved. There was also the problem of internal drafts, as some healers called them. If you slept with a full stomach and an open window, you might wake up with kidney pain, memory loss, and a new accent. At least, that's what they said. And since nobody really knew how the body worked, everyone believed it. The solutions for this digestive discomfort ranged from the absurd to the almost effective. One favorite method was to lie on your left side with a hot cloth on your stomach and pray. Literally, prayer was part of the treatment. Another technique was to walk in circles around the house, letting out small sighs and avoiding speaking to anyone so as not to interrupt the digestive process. And of course, there was always tea, made from local herbs, mysterious roots and a touch of faith, chamomile, mint, nettle, or any plant that didn't cause immediate hallucinations. The idea was that the infusion would calm the humors. What happened in practice was a bath of hot liquid on an irritated stomach, followed by a night of discreet gas, and promises to never eat fermented cabbage again. But since nothing was ever simple, the act of digesting was observed. The color of the skin, the texture of the breath, the sound of internal movements, everything was interpreted. A burp at the wrong time was analyzed with more attention than an eclipse, and if it came with sweating, that was it. Someone was going to call a monk. Even so, life went on, because in the Middle Ages, discomfort was the default state. Let's just say, if you got through an entire meal without feeling like you'd swallowed a brick or a curse, you could already consider the day a digestive success. Deep down, everyone knew that eating was just the first part of the suffering. The rest came later, slowly, as you tried to sleep, to the sound of your own intestines begging for help in Latin. Imagine the scenario. You're in love, maybe with someone from the village, the neighboring field, or even the court. If you have a lot of luck and zero realistic chance, you want to impress. You want to show that you are an interesting, desirable, sensitive person, and you think, I'll invite them to dinner. A classic, a universal gesture. But then you remember where you are. In the Middle Ages, the concept of a romantic dinner was flexible. First, because dinner itself was a luxury. Often the main meal happened in the middle of the day, and dinner was just a thin soup or a hurried bite of bread. Second, because romance wasn't exactly a priority. Most marriages were arranged, forced, or sealed in trades involving chickens, plots of land, or a jug of barley. But still, there were moments. Moments when two people tried to get to know each other, beyond the exchange of hoes and the knowing glance during the harvest. And when that happened, dinner came, and with it, the disappointment. The food, whatever there was. Literally, there was no lovingly planned menu. There was the broth left over from the day, maybe with extra grease because of the visitor. The bread was the same loaf that had been there for a week. The cheese had its own personality. And dessert, well, maybe a piece of overripe fruit that hadn't been attacked by insects yet. Maybe. The drink was the cloudiest wine available, or the beer that fermented too quickly and was bubbling on its own, served in a cracked cup, of course, but with intention. Because in the end, it was all about intention, even when it failed miserably. The location, the same old table, maybe with a cleaner cloth spread over it, if one existed. The lighting was by candlelight, which could almost be romantic, if the candle didn't smell like a mixture of wax, smoke, and rancid fat, and if the ceiling wasn't dripping, the conversation was simple. Exchanging glances, questions about the harvest, a comment or two about the number of rats that winter. The bread is less hard today than yesterday. Could be considered a compliment. This turnip is cooked perfectly, was practically a declaration of love. And the cold, always cold. The stone walls held in the dampness more than the heat. The two of them shivering, sharing a bowl, and trying to find some glamour in the smoky haze. Was there charm in this? Probably not. But there was an authenticity, a notion that if the two of them were sharing that bone broth with a piece of fat floating in it, maybe they could share more things in the future, like a bed of straw or lice. And if dinner evolved into something more, well, there was no sofa, no music, no Netflix. There was the barn, the dark corner of the kitchen, or the bedroom, with the mother-in-law snoring next to them. Romanticism, if it happened, was bovine, porcine, or parental. But still, there was love. Yes, love that tasted like undercooked onion. Love with the breath of garlic. And a total absence of silverware, but love somehow. So if you think you've had a bad date, remember, at least it wasn't in a smoke-filled room shared with a goat to the sound of bubbling soup, and with hard bread as the main aphrodisiac. Spoiler, sometimes it worked. Sometimes you wake up and your stomach is already begging for something that isn't coming anytime soon. It rumbles, it complains, it protests. But there is no breakfast waiting, just the silence. And a piece of hard bread that needs a hammer to be broken, when there's even that. Because the cruel truth is that in the Middle Ages, hunger wasn't the exception. It was the rule. It was routine. It was a discomfort as normal as the sound of cattle or the smell of your neighbor. Harvests failed frequently. The winter was long and stubborn, and storage was an art that few mastered. Almost no one knew exactly how to keep food good for a long time. So it spoiled, it rotted, it disappeared, and hunger moved in. It wasn't the hunger you feel at 6 p.m. when you skipped lunch. It was a dry, heavy hunger, one that settles into your bones and makes you chew on illusions. It was common for people to dream of food, literally, falling asleep imagining bites, waking up with a bitter taste in their mouth from so much nothing, In times of crisis, wars, plagues, bad weather, hunger became an epidemic. People ate whatever they could find. Tree bark, bitter herbs. Leather shoes, yes, shoes. There are records of entire families boiling strips of leather to make soup. The taste was indescribable, but it was better than swallowing wind. And when the situation got even worse, silence would take over the villages. The children stopped playing. The adults lost the sparkle in their eyes. Everything revolved around the next meal, or the next non-meal. Praying for bread became routine, and anyone who had a handful of grain was considered fortunate, or a target. There were genuine outbreaks of collective desperation, looting, fights over a turnip, accusations of witchcraft against anyone who had a chicken that was too fat. Food became a reason for paranoia, for division, for violence. A piece of cheese could generate arguments more intense than modern politics. In the cities, the scene was similar. The lower classes huddled in lines for crumbs. They depended on the goodwill of the church, donations from the rich, or the luck of finding an unsuspecting rat. And even the rich sometimes saw their pantries run dry, because hunger was democratic. It just took longer to knock on the doors at the top. And of course, hunger also disguised itself in forced regimens, in religious fasts, in days of penance, which in reality were just an excuse for the lack of food. Faith and an empty stomach walked side by side, and spirituality helped to digest the nothingness. Even at feasts there was restriction. The banquets were grandiose but specific, and they served as much to show off as to deceive. Look how much food. Today. Only today. The rest of the week, it was back to gruel, thin broth, and bread bounced off the elbow. Hunger shaped the bodies, the faces, the attitudes. It left the skin dull, the eyes sunken, and the smiles rare. Children grew up with no reserves, neither physical nor emotional. Eating became an act of survival, not pleasure. And when finally they managed to get a decent meal, the moment was almost solemn. They chewed slowly, not out of refinement, but for fear of it ending. Every spoonful was measured, even without a fork. The silence at the table said everything. Today, at least today, we will not sleep empty. So the next time you open the refrigerator and say, "There's nothing to eat," remember, in the 11th century, that was literal and constant and desperate. In the Middle Ages, hunger wasn't a feeling. It was a condition. Today, you hear about all kinds of diets: ketogenic, low-carb, intermittent fasting, gluten-free, protein only, juice only, wind only. The difference is that in the Middle Ages nobody gave it a name, because everyone was already living some extreme version of food deprivation, just not for health, for survival, and every so often by divine imposition. The church controlled not only the souls, but also the stomachs, and that meant many, many days of fasting throughout the year. Wednesday, Friday, the eve of anything sacred, the beginning of Lent, the end of Lent, any time with a vaguely sad-sounding name. During these periods, meat was forbidden, not because anyone was vegan by conviction, but because believing that the ox displeases God on certain days made more sense than trying to understand human digestion. So you think, okay, no meat, but they ate fish, right? Yes, when they had it. The problem is that fish was also a luxury item far from the coast, and what was left was fish salted into stone, or river fish that tasted like mud and had the texture of regret. Many resorted to eggs, but on some dates even eggs were banned. What was left? Vegetables, bread, water, thin soup, basically a medieval detox. Not because the liver was grateful, but because the church commanded it. And if you broke the fast, you didn't get a fine, you got eternal guilt, and sometimes penance involving prolonged kneeling. Curiously, there was also the fast of the rich, a highly elaborate diet to follow the religious rules. by circumventing them with creativity. If you couldn't have meat, you created a dish made of ground fish, molded to look like meat, a kind of hamburger of absolution. Or desserts so greasy and heavy that they made meat look like a light appetizer. But technically, it was still a fast, and nobody could complain. After all, it was all a matter of spiritual interpretation. There was also the so-called country diet, which basically consisted of eating what was available. Potatoes hadn't arrived from the Americas yet. Corn neither. Bananas, never heard of them. So it was turnip, barley, rye, cabbage, and that bread, which by this point has become a main character in this narrative, all of it repeated until the palate went on strike. And of course, illnesses also forced restrictions. People with stomach aches, and there were many, were advised not to eat certain hot foods, like garlic, wine, cheese, basically everything that gave life any flavor. The alternative was an oatmeal porridge with warm water, nutritious, monotonous, and ideal for anyone who had already given up on the pleasure of eating. Oh, and the most ironic detail, the poor, without even trying, lived on an almost completely plant-based diet. Little meat, almost no animal fat, and a lot of vegetables, cooked to death. But nobody sold this as a lifestyle. It was just what they had. And sometimes, not even that. So, yes. The Middle Ages already knew about intermittent fasting, reduced gluten, the monk's diet, forced veganism, and even food minimalism. Just without the feed posts, without the before and after photos, and without any pleasure involved. The medieval diet was simple. Eat what you can, when you can, and if you can. The rest is a miracle. In medieval life, almost no one cooked just for themselves. Not because they were naturally sociable, but because it was unfeasible. There wasn't enough firewood, not enough pots, not enough food, so the logical and desperate solution was to cook as a group, like an improvised supper, with a real chance of ending in a fight over a piece of bone. In small villages, especially among peasants, it was common for families to share the same fire, literally the same one, a large hole in the ground, or a crude fireplace in the middle of someone's house, who by luck or misfortune had enough space to gather the neighbors. The atmosphere was one of collaboration, or of silent tension. It all depended on the mood of the day and the accumulated hunger. Each person brought what they had, a handful of grain, an onion, a semi-living cabbage leaf. Someone threw it in the pot, another stirred with a spoon already burnt at the tip. And there the communal potage was created, a soup made of leftovers, hope, and side conversations. It was like a culinary lottery. You never knew what was going to come out of it. You only knew that it would be warm, and that with luck, it wouldn't kill anyone. The problem is, cooking together also meant negotiating space and decisions. How much salt? How long does it cook? Who is going to stir the pot? There was always someone who swore they knew their grandmother's recipe, another who wanted to add wine, and the one who refused to stir because I brought the turnip. I've done my part. And there were the children running in the middle, the dogs waiting for something to fall, the chicken entering slyly to steal a crumb, and the village elder complaining that in my day the soup was made with dignity and the bones were meatier. The environment was a kind of improvised choreography where everyone revolved around the fire, trying to look useful. In monasteries the idea was similar, but with more discipline. The monks cooked in shifts, in silence, always in silence, a thick silence broken only by the sound of boiling and the almost liturgical sound of the spoon stirring. The monastery kitchen was a temple, not of pleasure but of dietary obedience, and the dishes came out with monastic precision: soup, bread, something green, the same thing, every day. The miracle was anyone managing to swallow it without sinning in their thoughts. At popular festivals, things scaled up. Large cauldrons were placed in the town squares. There the people would gather to eat together, or in reality to fight for the best parts of the stew, before only the yellowish water with a strand of cabbage was left. It was the social event of the month, and the tension was proportional to the hunger. A slip of the ladle could turn into a brawl. A piece of meat that disappeared from a bowl became a case for a domestic inquisition. Even so, the communal kitchen held a certain charm, a collective memory of survival, because in the end, sharing the pot was also sharing the misery. And that created bonds made of cabbage, onion, and a lot of, is this done yet? Or are we adding more turnip? Today, sharing a kitchen can be annoying. In the Middle Ages, it was necessary, and despite the soot, the chaos, and the borrowed spoon that was never returned, it was still there, around the pot, that the people found a little comfort, and maybe an extra spoonful of gruel, if no one was looking. In the Middle Ages, especially among the rich, eating stopped being just a physiological act and became a performance, a spectacle, a parade of excess, exaggeration, and, sometimes, dishes that seemed more like culinary pranks. This was the prestige meal, where the food, get this, didn't even need to be good. It just needed to look expensive. The great lords and ladies loved to throw banquets, those with infinite tables, lined with embroidered fabrics, silverware that nobody used, and candlesticks that probably cost more than all the food served. The goal was to impress the guests, the servants, the spies, and even the angels. Everyone needed to leave there with one very clear feeling: I will never eat like this in my life. Except the funny part, or the tragic part, is that these banquets were more about seeing than eating. Often the dishes came in minuscule portions, covered in garnishes with strong smells and dubious combinations. Chickens sewn inside ducks, ducks stuffed with fish, fish decorated with gold dust, roasted pigs with an apple in their mouth and a crown on their head. All beautiful, all performative, all uncomfortable. There were dishes that came with political messages, like that famous swan, served whole, with its feathers re-implanted after cooking, positioned like a throne of meat, or pies stuffed with live birds. Yes, live, which would fly out when the crust was cut. A digestive jump scare to remind you that you were among the great. And of course, the abundance was displayed as a form of collective humiliation. Platters paraded through the room, one after the other, while the servants in the corners barely had soup for their own dinner. Eating was also a power play. Whoever could waste could rule. And the banquets were just that, dramatized waste. The etiquette was also its own theater. You couldn't lick your fingers in public, you couldn't spit bones on the floor, only discreetly into a corner of the tablecloth. You couldn't show hunger, because that was a peasant thing. But everyone was starving, and everyone pretended not to be. The hunger there was suffocated, under layers of sauce and appearance. And the cooks worked like misunderstood artists. They spent days preparing dishes that lasted 5 minutes on the table, and they knew they would be judged, not by the taste, but by the symmetry of the stuffed chicken with sweet rice inside. These banquets were so elaborate that many guests left more exhausted than satisfied, eating, sitting for hours, between speeches, musical performances, jesters and jugglers. There were those who fell asleep in their plates, those who faked fainting to leave early, and those who stole bread and hid it because nothing there was actually chewable. But perhaps the most symbolic detail of all is this: sometimes the host didn't even eat. He just watched, because the banquet deep down wasn't to feed. It was to show that he could feed. It was status, with the smell of grease. It was roasted, seasoned power, served with a silver spoon. Meanwhile, outside, the village ate thin gruel and prayed not to get sick, because luxury has always been a piece of theater, and like any good play, the ticket was expensive and the intermission snack non-existent. In the Middle Ages, eating wasn't just an act of necessity or pleasure. For those who had that luck, eating was a spiritual game, a kind of pact between your stomach, the heavens, and the invisible forces that supposedly controlled everything, from your digestion to the possibility of you waking up with a swollen tongue because of a curse. People believed with unshakable conviction that certain foods protected against evil. The absolute champion was garlic, not because it was tasty. It was used rather randomly, but because, according to belief, it scared away everything bad. Demons, witches, diseases, and even annoying people. The smell alone made half the village keep their distance. And that, in a way, already solved several problems. Then there was bread, but not just any bread, blessed bread, the kind made with special wheat flour, prayed over during Mass, and sometimes kept in pieces in one's pocket as an amulet. Some people believed that if you threw a piece of this bread into the fire during a storm, the lightning would avoid your house. Others said that placing the bread by the door prevented spirits from entering. Spoiler, the most that entered was a rat. Wine also had its symbolic role. Mixed with herbs, it was considered a cure. Pure, it was a ritual. Spilling wine, bad luck. Refusing wine, suspicious. Drinking wine with your right foot crossed, good luck in love. It was a beverage, but also a mystical compass. And sometimes just a mistake. Fish were even more complex. Some believed that certain types of fish could predict the weather, not by the behavior of the living fish, of course, but by the smell of the dead one. If the fish soured quickly, a storm was coming. If it released its bones easily, the daughter's marriage would be successful. If it sneezed oil, it was a miracle, which obviously made no sense at all, but making sense was never a requirement for superstition. And eggs, be careful. A broken shell on a full moon night attracted envy. Eggs with 2 yolks were a sign of pregnancy. And if you found an egg with no yolk, don't ask. Just throw it away and go pray. Fruits also carried hidden messages. An apple cut in half revealed good luck or bad, depending on the seed pattern. A grape in the pocket was good for business. Eating a pear upside down, yes, that was a practice, was a way to attract prophetic dreams, or more likely, indigestion. Even the act of cooking was surrounded by precautions. Stir the soup always in the same direction. Never let the spoon fall, a sign of an unwanted visitor. Never salt the food directly from your hand. It attracted discord, and hitting the spoon on the rim of the pot more than 3 times was opening a path for evil spirits. The result? Everyone cooked, tense, looking over their shoulders and murmuring prayers. And of course there was the legendary bread that doesn't rise. This was the great fear of the cooks. If the dough didn't rise, it was a sign of the evil eye, or worse, witchcraft. Some threw it out, others buried it. 1 or 2 did what any sensible person would do, pretended everything was fine, and served it with honey to disguise it. In the end, eating in the Middle Ages was always a little mystical. Every bite could be a blessing or a curse. Every ingredient carried more meanings than nutrients, and the kitchen, was almost an altar. Full of smoke, yes, but sacred nonetheless. Today, we read our horoscopes. Back then, they read the soup. If you've ever felt punished by a bad microwave meal, or that family dinner where everything has raisins, know that in the Middle Ages, this was taken to a much more institutional level. Because yes, there were punishments that involved food, or rather, the absence of it, or in some even worse cases, the presence of it, in forms you definitely don't want to remember before sleeping. Let's start with the classic. Fasting as penance. Committed a sin. Fast. Spoke ill of the priest. Fast. Slept too late on Sunday. Triple fast, with a side of dry bread and well water. The church knew how to use hunger as a spiritual tool. It was like a Reset button for the soul, except you starved and still felt guilty. And this wasn't that skip dinner kind of fast. This was fasting for days, sometimes with only one meal at sunset, other times nothing. Just the glorious company of a stomach that echoed like an empty cathedral. And the best part, this was all considered a cure, punishment and cure at the same time. It just depended on how much faith or desperation you had. For heretics, the punishments could be even more specific. There are records of people being fed only bread and water for weeks, as a way to purify the body and spirit. It sounds mild, but try eating the same dry bread and drinking the same cloudy water for 14 days. And then we'll talk about divine punishment. And in the monasteries, oh, there the punishment was refined. The monk who spoke out of turn could be put on a diet of silence, where he ate separately from the others, in absolute silence, staring at the wall and chewing thin lentil soup. It was the medieval equivalent of, go eat in your room and think about what you've done. Among nobles, there was also food humiliation, like serving a dishonored guest a plate that was purposefully smaller, cold, or unseasoned. A subtle warning, or not so subtle. We know what you did, and your supper will be proportional to your shame. Nothing like receiving a single boiled turnip as your main course to understand your place in the hierarchy. And in the villages, when someone committed a minor crime, they might be sentenced to cook for everyone during the religious festival. This wasn't an honor, it was a punishment, because cooking over a communal fire for 12 hours, without rest, without help, with 37 different requests and 3 chickens observing you, was hell in portions. There were also the more creative cases, like the fellow who was punished for theft by having to eat his own sandal boiled in turnip broth, or another who, for having deceived the priest, had to fast for 40 days and then eat an entire banquet by himself. An experiment that ended in fainting, vomiting, and a lesson learned, or not. The truth is, in the Middle Ages, the stomach was both victim and accomplice. It was used to teach lessons, impose respect, measure faith, and everyone, at some point, knew the pain of a meal. That felt more like a sentence. So, the next time someone tells you, you need to eat this, it's good for you, remember that was the exact speech the monks gave when they served onion soup with pigeon feathers to the penitent. When in doubt, just pretend you're on a spiritual fast. Today, eating in public is almost casual. Fast food, food courts, a packed lunch at the office, posting your lunch on Instagram stories. Now imagine living in a world where how you ate, who you ate with, and even where you sat to eat, could say everything about who you were and where you should shut up. In the Middle Ages, the meal was a ceremony, not because of the food itself, but because of the invisible hierarchy it reinforced. Especially in the great halls of castles and noble houses, where every detail of the meal functioned as a social megaphone. First, the order of serving. It wasn't everyone all at once, helping themselves. Nothing like that. The food was brought by order of importance. The lord of the house received the best piece of the game, the fluffiest bread, the cloudiest wine with the lowest chance of spontaneous fermentation. The most noble guests came right after, and the servants, with luck, got what was left on the bone, if there was anything left. Second, the position at the table. The closer to the host, the more prestige. Whoever sat at the far end of the table already knew that what was coming their way would be the lukewarm broth, the dry fish, and probably the pre-used napkin. Oh, and no talking, just chew and smile in silence. Third, behavior while eating. Eating with your hands. Acceptable, but with class. Shoving your face in the bowl, public humiliation, letting out a very loud burp, scandal, dropping food in your lap, one step away from social exclusion. Of course, everyone did this from time to time, but only the poor were judged for it. The etiquette was selective. In the monasteries, the meal was a religious theater. No one spoke, only the sound of spoons, of bread being broken, and of the monk, designated to read sacred texts, while the others chewed in a penitent rhythm. Eating there was a forced meditation, a turnip-flavored punishment, but perhaps the greatest example of food as a social weapon was the act of denying food. That's right. Saying no could be a declaration of power. Refusing a dish served by someone inferior, acceptable. Refusing the host's food, a grave offense. Refusing and still complaining about the seasoning, culinary and social heresy. Among the peasants, the rule was clearer. The more food on someone's plate, the more respect they had in the village. A well-served gruel showed status, a piece of meat drew attention, and whoever managed to get seconds on soup was practically a celebrity. In some festivities, eating competitions would emerge as a form of entertainment. But don't expect anything like an all-you-can-eat buffet. They were more like endurance challenges. Who can handle the most hot broth? Who can peel the most onions without crying? Who can chew this dry bread until the end without spitting? Hunger Games, culinary edition. And finally, there was always that cruel detail: being watched while you ate. This was common among servants and apprentices, eating under the gaze of the master, chewing, knowing that every movement could be interpreted as laziness, greed, or moral deviation. Eating in that context wasn't nutrition. It was a character test. In the Middle Ages, eating was more than just chewing. It was a public exam of status, self-control, and social interpretation. A bowl of soup could say everything about you. A piece of bread could promote you or condemn you. And if you knocked over the wine goblet, well, you'd better start fasting for penance. Again, you've just eaten. You're stuffed with soup, bread, turnip, and maybe that piece of dried meat that survived Lent. Your body is begging for rest, but medieval life doesn't exactly offer a hammock on the porch and a digestive tea. The post-meal rest came with an unwritten list of rules, fears, and promises. Rule number 1, do not lie down on a full stomach. This was practically a commandment. Lying down right after eating could attract the evil eye, turn the food into poison, or make your stomach drop to your feet. Yes, this was a popular theory. Apparently, organs had a mind of their own and would wander around the body if you didn't respect the digestive laws of the time. The solution? Walk slowly, very slowly. A little lap around the yard, a trip to the chicken coop, or just standing and staring at the fire. Some believed the heat from the fireplace helped with digestion. Others were just afraid of lying down and never waking up. So they just stood there, sweating, breathing deeply, and trying not to regurgitate the cabbage and onion. For the more religious or the simply desperate, there were specific prayers for digestion. Yes, you asked for divine help to not get sick. Some of these prayers included patron saints of the liver, of the stomach, and even of gas. It was a spiritual digestive combo. Praying for abdominal relief was as common as praying for rain. It was also common to use tight belts or sashes, believing that this held the food in the right place. The result? Poor circulation, discomfort, and a bloating that made even the most faithful question their vows. In the monasteries, the post-dinner period was silent and contemplative. Monks would walk in circles and murmuring psalms and trying to maintain physical self-control. Some would rub oil on their stomachs. Others simply pretended they hadn't eaten too much, because admitting gluttony was a sin, even when the food was lentil soup that smelled like a damp wall. Among the peasants, the post-meal rest was more direct. Sit on the floor, lean against the wall, sigh loudly, and accept your fate. Sometimes people would doze off, sitting up, with the spoon still in their hand, because the day had been long, the food was heavy, and sleep, well, sleep was the only democratic luxury. But there were dangers. Nocturnal flatulence was feared, not because of the smell, but because of the beliefs. It was believed that accumulated gas could bring visions, delusions, or spiritual visitations. If you passed gas in a strange way during the night, it was a sign that the devil was trying to escape through your backside. In short, be careful after eating the turnip. And of course, there was always the figure of the elder, who would say, "In my time, nobody ate and slept without spitting 3 times to the left." Nobody knew why, but everyone did it because, why not? Better safe than sorry. So yes, the medieval after dinner was almost a second act of the dietary drama. You didn't just have to chew and swallow, you had to spiritually, emotionally, and physically and process what you had just ingested. Today, we take an antacid and lie on the sofa. Back then, it was pray, walk in circles, and hope your soul didn't leave your body, along with the sour cheese. Today, crumbs are just the annoyance left on your keyboard, or the reason for a scolding for eating in bed. In the Middle Ages, they were a symbol of status, of hunger, and, above all, of injustice disguised as routine. Let's start with the origin. The bread was the main course, the utensil, the napkin, and sometimes a bed for ants. It was served in large, medium, and small pieces. The small pieces became the famous crumbs, and these crumbs had diverse fates, but none of them included the trash, because trash in the Middle Ages was something very relative, almost poetic, in its non-existence. In noble houses, crumbs were left on purpose as a gesture of charity. The noble would eat the center of the bread, wipe their fingers on the crust, the trencher, and then leave the crust there on the table as an offering. The intention was to feed the poor. In practice, it was the medieval equivalent of posting a selfie with the caption "Shao blessed" and thinking it solves the world's problems. The servants then would enter the hall after the banquet and collect everything: crumbs, bones, bits of fat, pieces, elegantly chewed. Everything was repurposed. They would heat the crumbs with broth, make little cakes, give them to their children, and no one complained. Because complaining about food, even if it had already been bitten by a baron with gingivitis, was a sign of pride. In the villages, crumbs were fought over. Children scoured the corners of the tables, the floor, the fireplace. Sometimes, even the nuns would show up to take what was left. The crumb was currency. Whoever had crumbs had something. Whoever didn't chewed air. And it wasn't just food, it was what it represented. Receiving crumbs from a local lord could be seen as a blessing or a humiliation, depending on the day and the pride of the stomach. At religious festivals, distributing crumbs was a symbolic act of humility. Look how generous I am. I gave my leftover bread to the people, and the people were grateful. Because between hunger and a wounded ego, hunger always screamed louder. As for meat scraps, those were guarded with almost reverence. A bone with a shred of fat became flavor for 3 different broths. A piece of toasted skin was a luxury. Everything was transformed, including what was already almost unrecognizable. There was even a protocol about who could eat what. Bigger crumbs went to the older workers, the smaller ones to the children. The house dog got what fell first. The cat stole what it could. And the rats, well, the rats were always one step ahead, gnawing on the future. Oh, and of course, there was the special altar bread. the leftovers from religious ceremonies, collected with care, wrapped in cloths, divided among the sick, because a blessed crumb was worth an entire meal, at least in the realm of mystical hopes. Today, we wipe the table and throw it in the trash. But there, in the 14th century, every little piece of bread was almost a small character, forgotten, but with a fundamental role in the script of each day. In the Middle Ages, even the crumb knew it was worth more than many people. We arrive, at last, to the digestive epilogue, between sighs, aches and nightly prayers, the grand anticlimax, the end of the meal, the end of the script, the end of your stomach's patience, and, with any luck, the beginning of your sleep, because after so many chewable miseries, it's time to lie down, be grateful, and promise to never again complain about yesterday's beans. Dinner is over. The bread was chewed with resignation. The soup got cold before it made sense. And the cheese gave one last sigh of mold before being swallowed with faith. Now the village sinks into shadow. You are lying down, or at least trying. Your bed is straw, shared with a sibling, 2 cats, and probably an insect that has had more meals than you today. Your stomach rumbles, not from hunger, but from protest. Still digesting that mix of turnip, onion, and mystery. Beside you, someone lets out a burp. No one reacts. This, after all, is a sign of health, of life, because if you can still burp, it means the soup didn't kill you. Outside, the wind rattles the improvised windows. The moon peeks through greasy clouds. A dog howls in the distance, maybe lamenting the bone it couldn't steal, or maybe just bored, like you, listening to your own intestines bubble. Before sleeping, people say one last prayer. They don't ask for luxury, just that tomorrow's food isn't spoiled, or that the bread isn't quite as hard as the bed, or that by some miracle someone shows up with a little meat, not much, just enough to remember the taste of hope. Some recite old prayers, others just whisper the names of the ingredients they know, like a litany: barley, turnip, barley, turnip, and so they fall asleep. Some from exhaustion, others from food hypnosis, and you still awake, but maybe now with a little less anger. Toward your modern refrigerator, your bed without thorns, your reheated rice, because after so many blocks of chewable suffering, it's impossible not to feel a minimum of modern gratitude. So, close your eyes, breathe deep. Remember that you live in a world with microwaves, with delivery, with chocolate, and if sleep still doesn't come, just think of an 11th century monk eating cold lentil soup for the 10th time this week. Good night, sweet dreams, and good digestion.